So I'm going to actually, we're going to turn to you guys in a minute. And we've been talking up here, and this is, the idea of this session is to be interactive. So I would love to hear from all of you out there what you think of these ideas, our three winners, and especially those of you that may have contributed to these ideas and you wrote them down and put them up on the board, or those of you that feel that your idea should have been one of the top three. That'd be interesting too. So do we have anybody react? Yeah.
So I had two reactions. One, by boundary organizations, I'm assuming we're also including some of the existing, not just freestanding boundary, but including some of the places like AAAS or AIBS who are serving in that role in some significant part of the work that they're doing. So that was one thing. The other thing is that the issue of reward system gets to the question of intrinsic versus extrinsic rewards that came up at the first day. And I think it's an issue I just want to call back up to us to think about. What is it that, if we're trying to build an infrastructure, what can we affect?
And that did come in fourth place. I always think of the poor guys in the Olympics that come in fourth. Although in this case, I think it still got some gold. Yeah, Brooke.
Well, so I feel compelled to speak because the top two things are the two things my organization does. And what's interesting to me about that is, on one hand, I felt like, oh, great, everyone thinks that what our organization does is really great and is what's needed. But I'll tell you, as the person who fundraises for our organization, it is really hard to raise money for the two top things. And so that makes me really kind of concerned about other people who do those things and everything else that would come after it, because we don't have $100 billion to spend on this. And this is something that Rick has brought up before and that we've talked about, which is when you have limited dollars, which was kind of this exercise because you had 10 coins, but it wasn't limited dollars in the scope of your budget, that you have to also have electricity and education in your life. I just worry about that kind of scale. We all recognize it's important, but it's actually been really hard to free up resources to do those things. And then my second point, which is related to what you said, Bruce, the reward system is a really interesting one, because I do feel like, as we've been talking about infrastructure, that's a cultural aspect of the infrastructure, but there are things you can invest in to help move the needle on culture, and I'd love to think about what those are, to just kind of have us all keep thinking about that, because I do think that is a really important part of all of this, is the cultural changes that need to happen, and funding and money can help change culture in ways.
Do people think that there's a fundamental change that's needed in a culture? And feel free to answer up in the panel too. I mean, is that what's underlying some of this? I mean, the reward system is kind of an obvious one. I mean, we talked about that in the roundtable since the beginning. The disincentives to communicate sometimes. But yeah.
Yeah, Rick said this in his opening talk about summarizing from day one, which is, and Bruce did too, that the research shows that scientists are not motivated by extrinsic values. And I think that that's interesting, but I also kind of feel like, well, duh, because there aren't any. And so the question I think is interesting is, what happens if there were extrinsic rewards? And might that open pathways for people to do things instead of just the highly motivated people right now?
Yes, and I think the obverse of that is true too, that they are not unmotivated by negative extrinsic rewards. I think was really what the research was pointing at. But I think a lot of times we lose track of, particularly again, I keep coming back to the demand side, we lose track of the extent to which we think we have a way to fix some of these problems from the demand side. And there's a fundamental issue in American culture that is lack of inquiry that's school-based now, and I think in some ways I've in my old age have come to the conclusion that if we could just do a better job of general education, we would do a much better job of science communication and build that better audience. And yet we continue to look at ways to stimulate adult education and adult engagement and never put our dollars where they really would, I think, matter. And it was never one of the things we talked about, which is in a robust education system that creates the demand for the science communication that we would do.
Sorry, but isn't that an extrinsic reward? Like education and public awareness is extrinsic. Sorry. So what I'm saying, my point, I actually disagree with the fact that there needs to be demand to motivate science communication. I feel like that should be an intrinsic part of the process, and if everybody's communicating science, then we can worry about how to meet the demand that may or may not be there. But the problem, to me, is that scientists don't communicate, aren't trained to communicate, which is why I put a lot of my money in the training bucket, because I feel like that is the biggest barrier to scientists participating in communication, is their ability and their skill level with communication.
Well, and that's where I put all my dollars too. And I put them there because I think that core communication competencies are critical not just for science, but for public citizenry. But particularly for science, what I'm concerned about is that the pipeline of people who come into the business of being science or other communicators is fundamentally shortchanged by an education system that does not value inquiry-based education, that values other values instead. And that's not necessarily an intrinsic or extrinsic reward. It is a fundamental cultural change that I don't think we're prepared to address.
Okay, we'll get a couple more, and then what I want to do, I want to shift us a little bit to, talking about responding to these ideas, and then the other part of our session is where do we go from here? And why don't we hear from you all out there that had your hands up, and then we're going to shift over, hear from Erica and Andrew. So, Martin, I think you had.
So I'm not sure, do I have to recognize myself too?
Yeah.
Martin Storkstig, Director of the Board on Science Education here. And I want to respond a little bit to the K-12 because there was a bucket and scientists in it and so on and so forth. And when it comes to this community, thinking about where this as a community wants to invest its resources, I think I would strongly urge to stay away from K-12 because K-12 has its own mechanisms and it's currently trying to reform itself. The whole idea that the next generation science standards are based on 8 scientific and engineering practices. I mean, whether they will be successful certainly will not depend on a bunch of scientists meddling with this. It will be helpful. But what I'm saying here is when you have to put your chits somewhere, this is not where I would invest because somebody is already investing here. Invest somewhere else. That would be my strong recommendation.
Okay. Yep.
I want to come back to the idea of changing the culture, which it's an interesting, the tenure system should be changed so it includes more public outreach. More scientists should be enthused, but it's essentially, I don't think you can change the culture without doing a number of the other things that we're talking about. The culture is based upon people's experiences at doing all of these things. And so I think if you have people who are better communicators, if you have avenues, boundary organizations, if you want to call them that, but an infrastructure that helps match those, you'll get people who are now more enthusiastic about what they're doing, and that will lend itself to a changing culture. So I don't think you can change a culture without changing all of these other structures that are around it. I'll leave it at that.
A little bit of cart and horse there, I think. Yeah.
That is the culture.
Yeah. Yeah.
I just have one quick comment. It'd be interesting to do this game again, limiting the budget to say, okay, your organization has 10 coins to spend on science communication and your own stuff. How much are you going to give to each of these buckets? How much are you giving for yourself?
A little more real world there, yes.
If we're talking in reality, I mean, this is sort of theoretical, but I think that might be an interesting exercise. And I want to play with the gold again.
Is somebody calling in? Okay. Do we have somebody on the phone?
David, this is Kai.
Hi, Kai.
I wanted to build on this last culture point a little bit, and also this question about how you'd spend the coins if you had a different rule for allocating them. It's noteworthy, I think, that if you look in the philanthropic sector, Amanda and I, both from the conservation world, are the only 2 people in the conservation philanthropy space that I think are doing any funding in this area. That could be, Andy may know better than we about this, but at least in this case of the Packard Foundation, we think of ourselves as a very science-based, science-guided Foundation, our expenditures on Compass and the allied funding is under 0.5% of what we do. As I mentioned before, 0.5% is something like tenfold more than the overall philanthropy impact in the R&D space. And I think what's going on here partly is in the culture is an undervaluing of what the cost of information actually is. Information and knowledge really is. We underspend on education. We're faced with a web world where there's lots of content, a lot of it garbage, but it's all available at zero cost. And so the question of how legitimate providers like Science Magazine are going to recover their costs, I think is a very compelling economic problem. That's part of the culture that we have to deal with, and it's something that I think is not only an imposing barrier, but it's a barrier that seems to me to be getting higher rather than lower. So that's another factor I'd like to put on the table.
Interesting, thank you. What's that? Okay, well, I was going to shift to our next question, but you're organizing the meeting. You can say something.
Yeah, Kai, I wanted to just respond to what you said and add some other perspective too. Is what you noted that you and Amanda are the only two folks in the conservation philanthropy sector who focus on this, who certainly have the word science in their title. And one of the things that I've found interesting as I've been fundraising for what Compass does for a number of years is what Kai and Amanda have in common is really rare, which is they're investing in the communication of science because that helps us think about problems in front of us and solutions. There are actually a lot of funders who are issue focused, like Wilberforce and Packard are, without the same appreciation of the scientific process and the role of science. And so we've actually turned down funding from foundations who have come to us and said, can you find a scientist who works on this to communicate this next week? Which is counter to what we try to do, which is trying to get science out there. And so it goes back to the people not really appreciating the value of science, which is a much bigger issue, and how science happens and how that process happens and how it gets out there. And we've been trying to educate and get people to understand that and think about that, because it doesn't just exist at your fingertips when you want it for a specific time or agenda.
Yeah, I should say, since you were mentioned by Kai, did you have a response?
So I agree with everything that Kai said, and you know, Kai and I have been working within our funder community, and there's a broad interest and appreciation of science, but when it comes down to it, as Brooke said, a lot of foundations are issue driven, and so they're starting somewhat with the agenda and the platform first, and the science comes second, and it's very few that go the other way. And can we shift more foundations as well as more NGOs, as well as more agencies, as well as more businesses to start with the science first? But it all comes back to why are we involving science in the process? And I think what Bill said at the beginning of, is this about sustainable infrastructures for science communication or for providing sustainable societal benefits? And I think that's a great point. And so, for me, and I will just keep hammering this point, why are we communicating science and to whom?
Right. Andrew, did you want to respond?
Just very briefly, again, because Kai
And then I want to have you to answer our next question.
So one way to think about this is that, my program really works, as Compass does with communication, works on the process of science, but more broadly on scientific integrity as well as communication and so on. And that's not an investment that most people feel they need to make. They just assume the science process is there, and it's not. It's under threat from lots of different places, and that's not restricted to any one sector, government, industry, or NGO. All of those places, as well as in the media, have some threats to the actual process by which we believe good scientific information is created. And so if you're going to communicate science, you actually need to protect that process. It's not just speaking out. It's what you're saying, and I think that goes to what Kai's points were.
Yeah, and I think what you're saying is really important too, especially, I mean, there's so many levels and layers here, but cause-oriented groups too, you know, as a journalist, I have to be a little careful because, I mean, I'm aware that they have a point of view and sometimes quite passionate one, and, you know, balancing, for instance, you know, industry, if you're, say, around an environmental issue, and environmental groups, and, you know, all the various other players in between. So I think as we're talking about communication training, it isn't just the science, or actually maybe it should be just the science, you know, the facts, but there obviously is a lot more that goes into this, because any of us who are interested in science, there is a passion there at some level and something we believe in. There's a reason why we personally do this. So I think one needs to keep in mind in this broad category of communication training, it could, you know, go the right way or not. So